Men around me fell, some screaming, others silent as they hit the ground. But there was no stopping, no time to think. Just run. Run and survive. I hit the dirt hard, feeling the impact in my bones as I slid into a shallow crater. I pressed myself into the earth, trying to disappear, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. Bullets snapped overhead, and the sound of a machine gun somewhere to my left filled the air with a relentless, metallic clatter. The officers had told us that Wake Island would be easy, just another stepping stone in Japan's glorious expansion. The Americans had been caught off guard in Hawaii, and we were assured they would crumble quickly here too. I believed it. We all did. After all, the Emperor's will was unstoppable, and we were his sword. The sea stretched out in every direction, a vast expanse of blue and grey, broken only by the line of Japanese ships cutting through the waves. The steady hum of engines filled the air as we sailed toward our target Wake Island. I stood on the deck of our transport ship, surrounded by my comrades, all of us brimming with excitement and pride. We had heard the news of the stunning victory at Pearl Harbor just days before, and the morale among the men was high. We felt invincible, like we were riding the very tide of history. "Move forward," the sergeant's voice rang out, barely audible over the chaos. I looked to my right, where a few of my comrades had made it to another patch of cover. I forced myself to move, crawling through the sand, keeping my head low. Every muscle screamed at me to stop, but I pushed on, inch by inch, feeling the ground tremble beneath me as artillery shells slammed into the earth around us. I risked a glance up, my eyes stinging from the sand and smoke. Ahead, I could see the outline of the American bunkers, hidden behind sandbags and barbed wire. The officers had said we would have air support, but there was no sign of it. It was just us, pinned down on the beach, scrambling for cover under the onslaught of enemy fire. But as the hours passed, and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a sliver of doubt worked its way into my mind. Would it really be as easy as the officers said? I shook the thought away. There was no room for doubt. We were soldiers of the Emperor. We would not fail. Then I saw the sergeant throw the grenade. Time seemed to slow for a moment as it sailed through the air, landing just inside the bunker. A heartbeat later, the explosion tore through the sandbags, silencing the machine gun in an instant. The relief was palpable, but it was short-lived. More gunfire erupted from a different position, and the advance stalled again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the deck, I caught sight of one of the destroyers on the horizon. Its silhouette looked almost peaceful against the fading light, a deceptive calm before the storm. Somewhere out there, just beyond that line of ships, was Wake Island, a small dot in the Pacific, but an important one. Securing it would tighten our grip on the Pacific, pushing the Americans further back. Victory here meant another step toward the great destiny of Japan. The night fell, and the order came to rest. But sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts were filled with what awaited us at dawn. Would the Americans fight back, or would they fold as quickly as they had at Pearl Harbor? I pictured myself charging up the beach, my comrades beside me, driving the enemy into retreat. Glory awaited us. I could almost feel it within reach. The mood on the ship was a strange mix of calm and anticipation. Some of the men were laughing, sharing stories to pass the time. Others were quietly checking their rifles, adjusting their gear, mentally preparing for the fight. I sat with my squad, our helmets beside us, listening to our sergeant lay out the plan once again. We were to land at dawn, hit the beaches hard, and overwhelm the American defenders. The officers had stressed that this would be quick, decisive. A swift blow, and then the island would be ours. In the distance, the shape of Wake Island began to rise from the ocean, a jagged strip of land barely visible in the morning mist. I could feel my pulse quicken. The moment had come. I grabbed my helmet, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and joined the others on deck. The air was thick with tension now. No more laughter, no more idle chatter. The time for talk was over. We were ready to land. Ready to fight. Ready to claim victory. I was packed shoulder to shoulder with my squad, each of us silent, focused. Some stared at the horizon, Others kept their eyes down, lips moving in silent prayers. My heart hammered in my chest, the excitement from the night before now replaced with a gnawing tension. This was it. This was the moment we had trained for, and it was nothing like I had imagined. The landing craft rocked violently as it cut through the choppy waters, spray flying into the faces of the men huddled together inside. The roar of the engines drowned out any attempt at conversation. All around us, the thundering sounds of naval artillery from our ships filled the air, pounding the beaches of Wake Island ahead. The officers had promised that the barrage would soften up the Americans, crush their defenses, and allow us to land unchallenged. I clung to that promise as tightly as I clutched my rifle. "We need to take out that machine gun," the sergeant growled, pointing to the bunker up ahead. I followed his gaze and saw the flash of the gun muzzle through a gap in the sandbags, its fire cutting down anyone who dared advance. The sergeant pulled a grenade from his belt and nodded to me. "Cover me," he ordered. I ran as fast as I could, my eyes fixed ahead on the thin line of cover, just beyond the sand. Explosions from mortars sent plumes of dirt and smoke into the air. Shouts in Japanese and English mixed with the deafening chaos, creating a hellish symphony of war. The plan, the promise of an easy landing, crumbled in an instant. The Americans were not disorganized. They were waiting, entrenched, and they were firing with deadly precision. I reached the next piece of cover, panting and shaking. A few others had made it too, but many hadn't. I could see their bodies scattered across the beach, some motionless, others writhing in pain. The smell of burning oil, gunpowder, and blood filled my nostrils. This was nothing like the battles we had trained for. This was chaos, pure and brutal. Suddenly, the craft lurched as we hit a wave, jolting me out of my thoughts. The sergeant at the front, standing firm, despite the violent motion, raised his hand and barked the order to prepare for landing. My hands shook as I adjusted my helmet and checked my rifle one last time. This was real. This was happening. The time for wondering was over. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired blindly at the bunker, trying to suppress the gunners. The sergeant dashed forward, his body low to the ground, moving with an agility that seemed impossible in the storm of bullets. I kept firing, my hands trembling as I reloaded, trying to focus through the panic. We were pinned, but we couldn't stop. I could see the determination in the faces of the men around me, even through the fear. We had to push forward. The Emperor's will demanded it, and we had no choice but to obey. I tightened my grip on my rifle, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was strange how natural it felt now, as if it had become an extension of me. There had been a time when the thought of battle had filled me with dread, but not anymore. I was ready. We were all ready. Our training had been brutal, but it had prepared us well for this moment. The officers had drilled into us the importance of discipline, of striking hard and fast. The ship rocked gently beneath my feet, but I barely noticed. My thoughts were far away, on the battlefield ahead and on the family I'd left behind in Japan. My mother had been so proud when I left to serve in the Imperial Army. She'd cried as I boarded the train, waving goodbye through the crowd. My father had been quieter, nodding approvingly, but I could see the pride in his eyes. The thought of their faces gave me strength. I was fighting for them, for my country, for the Emperor. As I lay there on the hard floor of the ship's cabin, the sound of the waves lapping against the hull, I allowed myself to dream of the victory ahead. By this time tomorrow, I thought, Wake Island would be ours, and we would be one step closer to securing Japan's rightful place as the dominant power in the Pacific. As we moved toward the landing craft, I took one last look at the rising sun, its orange glow casting a surreal light on the water. It felt like an omen, but of what, I couldn't say. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the battle raged on, and the beach became a graveyard of twisted metal and broken bodies. We had landed, but the victory that seemed so certain the night before was slipping away. The Americans were fierce, and Wake Island was not ready to fall. Through the haze of the bombardment, the faint outline of Wake Island became clearer. Low, jagged terrain, a few patches of greenery, and those beaches that we would soon storm. The Americans were out there, somewhere in those positions, waiting for us. My mind raced with the possibilities. Would they be disoriented by the shelling? Would they flee or fight? I could hear the cries of the other soldiers as the craft slowed, grinding against the sandy bottom just offshore. The front gate slammed down into the water, and without hesitation, we surged forward. My boots splashed into the sea, the cold water instantly soaking through my uniform, but there was no time to think about it. The roar of gunfire erupted around us as we charged up the beach, bullets whizzing past, splintering the wooden sides of the craft behind us. "Move up," our squad leader shouted, motioning for us to spread out. We were in a small patch of palm trees, using the foliage as cover from the enemy snipers who had zeroed in on us. I could hear the distinct crack of rifle fire, followed by the thud of bullets hitting the trees around us. One of the men beside me grunted as a round struck him in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. There was no time to help him. "Now!" "Move," the squad leader shouted, and we sprang into action. "This is it," he said, his words barely audible over the distant gunfire. "We take that bunker, and the island is ours." "We'll circle around," the squad leader whispered, his voice strained. "Get inside and take them out." "Get down," our squad leader shouted, and we dove for cover behind a cluster of rocks. Dirt flew into the air as enemy rounds hit the ground nearby, and I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as the reality of the situation hit me. We were pinned down, unable to move without exposing ourselves to the heavy machine gun fire coming from the bunkers. Ahead of us, the airfield stretched out, its flat expanse of asphalt a stark contrast to the rugged island landscape. American fighter planes, grounded and damaged from the initial bombardment, lay scattered along the runway like broken toys. But even as we pushed closer, the sight of the airfield offered no comfort. It was heavily defended, and the Americans were fighting tooth and nail to hold onto it. The airfield was the key. That much had been drilled into us from the start. Securing it was our primary objective, the gateway to controlling the island. But as the hours of battle wore on, it became painfully clear that taking it would be anything but easy. I pressed forward, staying as low as I could, my rifle ready. We had to clear the control tower, the nerve center of the airfield's defenses. The squad leader pointed toward it, a squat building perched at the edge of the runway, surrounded by sandbags and barbed wire. Machine gun fire rattled from its windows, cutting down any attempt to approach it head-on. I nodded, feeling a pit of dread in my stomach. Getting close to that tower seemed impossible, but there was no room for doubt. We had to do it, or we would be stuck here, exposed and vulnerable. With a deep breath, I followed the others, creeping through the undergrowth, inching closer to the enemy stronghold. I went in first, my rifle raised, heart racing. The control tower loomed ahead, its windows blacked out by smoke and gunfire. I could hear the Americans inside, shouting orders to each other, their voices muffled by the thick concrete walls. My pulse quickened as I crept closer, my finger hovering over the trigger. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire erupted from the side. One of the men in our squad screamed as he was hit, collapsing in the dirt beside me. Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. We were too close to turn back now. As I looked out from the shattered windows of the tower, I saw the chaos of the airfield below. Our men were still fighting to secure the runway, and the American resistance showed no signs of faltering. We had a long, bloody fight ahead of us, and there was no guarantee that we would make it out alive. Our orders were clear: we would advance along the western ridge and take out a series of bunkers that had been raining machine gun fire on our positions for days. The Americans had dug in well, but our commanders were confident that with the fresh reinforcements, we could finally break their lines. But for the moment, we had taken a step closer to victory. The airfield was within our grasp, and with it, the control of Wake Island. The morning of the final assault was eerily quiet, almost as if the island itself had taken a deep breath before the inevitable storm. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was the only reminder that we were still surrounded by the vast ocean, but even that seemed distant, almost unreal. Wake Island had become a world of its own, a battlefield, where every rock and tree held the memory of the lives lost over the past days. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The last 3 days felt like a blur of violence and death. I hadn't slept more than an hour at a time, my body constantly on edge, waiting for the next order, the next attack. Every muscle ached, and my hands were raw from gripping my rifle so tightly. But there was no room for weakness, no time to think about how tired or hungry we were. The mission came first, always the mission. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of a grenade detonating echoed from the other side of the ridge. That was our signal. The flanking team had engaged the enemy, creating a distraction. I dashed forward, my heart racing as I sprinted toward the first bunker. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. Bullets whizzed past my head, but I kept moving, focused on the task at hand. The entrance to the bunker loomed ahead, and I could see the muzzle flash of the machine gun inside. Without hesitating, I lobbed a grenade into the opening and threw myself to the ground, covering my head as the explosion shook the earth. The blast sent debris flying into the air, and for a moment everything went silent. Then, the gunfire resumed, this time from our own men as we stormed the bunker. Inside, the scene was chaos. The walls were blackened from the explosion, and the stench of burning flesh filled the air. I fired my rifle at the few surviving American soldiers who were still trying to regroup after the blast. One by one, they fell, their bodies slumping against the walls of the bunker. I nodded, gripping my rifle tightly. We had come too far to turn back now. With a final deep breath, we charged forward. The sound of gunfire filled my ears as we climbed the rocky slope, pushing toward the last American stronghold. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I forced myself to keep going. I could see the enemy soldiers inside the bunker, their faces grim as they fired down at us. I ducked behind a rock, reloading my rifle, when I saw one of our men toss a grenade into the opening. The explosion rocked the bunker, and the gunfire ceased. We had done it. As I stood there, panting and drenched in sweat, I looked out over the battlefield. The island was quiet now, the sounds of war replaced by the gentle rustling of the wind through the palm trees. Wake Island was ours. And I knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more battles, more bloodshed. But for now, at least, the island was ours. By the time we received the order to advance toward the airfield, we had already lost many men. The beach was behind us, littered with the remains of those who had not made it through the initial push. My uniform was soaked with sweat and grime, the stench of cordite and death hanging in the air like a suffocating cloud. But there was no time to stop, no time to grieve for the fallen. The mission still had to be completed. We moved cautiously through the broken terrain, the ground scarred by craters and debris from the earlier bombardment. The island, once serene and quiet, now seemed like a desolate wasteland, every inch of it contested by bullets and blood. The Americans had dug in deeper than we had expected, turning every building, every rock, into a defensive position. We were advancing, but at a terrible cost. Our squad was tasked with flanking the airfield, moving in from the north to cut off the American supply lines. The plan was simple in theory, but as we neared the perimeter, the resistance grew fiercer. Mortar fire rained down on us, the explosions sending up clouds of dust and shrapnel. I kept my head low, running from one piece of cover to the next, my heart pounding in my chest. The ground seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the battle. Our artillery pounded the airfield, but the American defenders held firm, returning fire with precision. I could see their helmets bobbing behind the sandbags, and the muzzle flashes of their weapons as they poured lead into our positions. Every step we took was a gamble, each second spent exposed to potential death sentence. The squad leader tossed a grenade toward the tower's entrance, the explosion sending chunks of debris flying. "Go," he yelled, and we rushed forward. We reached the edge of the control tower's defenses. The barbed wire glistened in the sunlight, a cruel barrier between us and our objective. The squad leader pulled out a pair of wire cutters, his hands steady despite the chaos around us. One by one, he snipped through the wire, creating a gap just wide enough for us to slip through. I charged through the smoke, my rifle at the ready. Inside the control tower, the air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The Americans were there, scrambling to regroup after the explosion. I fired without thinking, the recoil of the rifle jarring my shoulder as the bullets tore through the room. The fight inside was brutal and chaotic. We fought in close quarters, ducking behind overturned desks and equipment, firing at point-blank range. The Americans fought with a desperation I had never seen before, but we had the advantage of surprise. One by one, we cleared the rooms, the sound of gunfire echoing through the narrow corridors. We knew this would be the last push. Reinforcements had arrived during the night, and we were ready to throw everything we had at the remaining American defenses. The airfield was mostly in our hands now, but scattered groups of enemy soldiers were still holding out in bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortified positions across the island. We had to root them out, every last one of them, if we were going to secure complete control. When the last of the defenders fell, I stood there, panting, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. The control tower was ours, but at what cost? The floor was littered with bodies, both American and Japanese. The airfield was still contested, the battle far from over. But for now, we had taken a critical position. I moved in formation with my squad, keeping low as we crept through the underbrush. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the island, which provided us with some cover. But as we approached the ridge, the familiar crack of gunfire split the air, followed by the thud of bullets hitting the ground around us. They had spotted us. We needed to find a way to break their line. Our squad leader motioned to a pair of soldiers to circle around and try to flank the enemy position. As they crawled through the underbrush, I exchanged glances with the man next to me. His face was covered in dirt and sweat, his eyes wide with fear. I realized then that we were all afraid, no matter how much we tried to hide it. But fear didn't matter now. Survival did. The seconds dragged on as we waited for the signal. The sound of gunfire filled the air, a constant reminder of the danger we were in. I could hear the Americans shouting to each other, their voices faint but determined. They knew we were coming, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. The battle continued throughout the day, a brutal, relentless assault as we moved from one bunker to the next. Each one was a bloody struggle, with the Americans fighting fiercely to hold their ground. We took heavy casualties, but inch by inch, we advanced. By the time the sun began to set, the final bunker was in sight. It was perched on a rocky outcrop, overlooking the airfield. The enemy fire was weaker now, sporadic bursts from what remained of the defenders. We were close to victory, but we all knew that the final push would be the hardest. We had taken the first position, but there were still more bunkers ahead. I stepped outside, breathing heavily, my hands shaking from the intensity of the fight. The rest of the squad was already moving toward the next objective, and I knew I had to keep going. There was no time to rest. Wake Island had been conquered. But as the adrenaline faded, I couldn't help but feel a hollow emptiness. We had won, but at what cost? The beach, the airfield, the ridges, they were all littered with the bodies of my comrades. The victory felt bittersweet, knowing how many had fallen to secure this tiny patch of land in the middle of the Pacific.